right, so today we're going to be in 1 Samuel, chapter 16 through 20. And we're going to do a little bit of review, my Bible, a little bit of review about what we learned in the previous chapters. So last time we were talking about the decline of Saul's kingdom, right? So we're transitioning from Saul to David today. And what we saw with that is sort of three characteristics, right? So let's put them over here, right? So Saul is rejected by the people. He's rejected by God. And then finally, he's rejected by his own son, Jonathan. Okay? And we're going to pick up there and look into how David reverses all of that by gaining favor with all of these groups of people. Okay, so let's just jump in. And again, as usual, we're not going to read everything. We're just going to hit some high points as we go along. The Lord said to Samuel, "How long will you grieve over Saul, since I have rejected him from being king? Fill your horn with oil and go. I will send you to Jesse the Bethlehemite, for I have provided for myself a king among his sons." Okay, so the idea is that God is transitioning his favor for the kingdom from Saul to David. Now, there's some politics that we need to talk about here, which is the difference between Saul and David, okay? So Saul, if you go back and read all the sections of that, first of all, Saul looks like he was supposed to be a king. He's taller than everyone else. He's a military leader. He's sort of everything you think of as a king, right? He's the Hollywood version of a king. He's also from the tribe of Benjamin. Now that's important because Benjamin is generally thought of as one of the smallest tribes in Israel. And in fact, Saul makes that point, let me flip back there, when he gets selected, that he is, from the smallest tribe there is, right? Let's see. Yes. And so he says, who am I but not a Benjamite, the least of all of the tribes of Israel, and my clan is the humblest of all of the tribes of Israel. Why have you spoken this way to me? And this is back in chapter 9, verse 21. Right? That we get this idea that he comes from the least powerful tribe. Which is kind of significant if you think about it from a political sphere, because that means they were trying to pick a neutral character. Right? I don't know if that's actually what was happening here. But they're not picking the king from the biggest tribe, they're picking him from the smallest tribe. But they're picking the guy who looks like a king, right? So again, they're trying to do what I would think of, sort of, Saul represents sort of the Hollywood king of Israel, right? He's the one that's like handsome and good looking and a foot taller than everybody else, but he comes from like nowhere, he's like neutral, it's very kind of, we're not showing favoritism. This is the guy who should have brought everyone together. But he doesn't. And in fact, that may be part of the discourse, is that when we get into kings, for instance, the kings who were rejected by God in the Bible, we know from history were actually very successful kings. Right? So I won't steal my thunder for what I'm going to talk about with kings over there. But great military leaders in the popular sphere are not the ones that God favors. Okay? Now, David is going to be the opposite. He's going to be he really is the seventh son of a nobody. Right? Bethlehem is a small little town in the middle of nowhere, basically. And he's not even the oldest son. We're going to see later on in chapter 16 here. He's not the oldest, he's the youngest. He's the little boy. And also, he's from the tribe of Judah. So this is where we have a little bit of a reversal here. Now, Judah is one of the most powerful tribes. And we don't really know whether Judah was powerful before David or because of David, so I will say that. But historically, Judah is a really large tribe. It has a large allotment in the book of Judges for the amount of people it has. It controls a good amount of territory, and good territory of that, right? It is really good land. And so it's very powerful in the way the ancient world would have looked at it. Is, can you grow sheep, grow crops, plant vineyards? Do you have money? That's what Judah is. But he's like the nobody from the middle of Judah, right? So we already have the Bible setting up a distinction between the two kings and the sort of rivalry therein, right? So we have the guy who's the king from the nobody nation, or the guy who's not a king from the big boy nation. Okay. So, again, you can read for yourself what happens, but all of the sons of Jesse that Jesse thinks are the ones that Samuel wants. He parades them and Samuel's like, nope, not him. Nope, not him. Nope, I don't want him. And then he gets in and goes, well, that's all the sons I had. He goes, is this all you have? Because God told me that one of your sons was supposed to be king. He goes, oh, well, I mean, like, the little boy is out tending the sheep, but you didn't want him. He's like, no, I want all of your sons. Get him, right? I want the one that you don't want. In fact, that's the way that God describes him to Jesse, right? Is that I will send you to the one who no other will want, right? Now, what we see is immediately after Samuel anoints David, God transfers his presence from Saul to David, right? So we immediately have David moving into being accepted by God, right? The Spirit of God moves on to David and off of Saul. And Saul knows it because he feels in his spirit this sort of antagonism, right? So it says, a harmful spirit from the Lord tormented him in verse 14 of chapter 16. Now what's interesting here, and what I'm going to point out to you, is we start seeing a series of stories that are going to legitimate the transfer of power from Saul to David. And I want you we're going to pause here and talk about some biblical criticism for just a second. One of the issues that we have when we look at the Bible is, why is this story here, right? We don't even think of that from a theological perspective, like what is God trying to teach us about the story? But also, like, why did the biblical writer use this story and not this other story? Do you see what I'm saying? Sort of like a more of a literary level. Like, what is the point of the story? Not just a moral of it, but like the selection of the stories. Because obviously there are many more stories that we could have been told about these people's lives. Why did we pick this one? Okay, and that becomes more apparent when we get to a collection of stories which all seem to do the same thing, and there's a little bit of redundancy here. So in historical biblical criticism, this is called source criticism, right? The idea that there were multiple sources, multiple versions of the story, and someone came along and sort of threw them all in a blender and made fruit salad out of all of these different stories, right? It's very common when we look at Genesis that we have the source criticism occurs in Genesis. We have some source criticism we can talk about in Exodus and in Deuteronomy. Basically what the point I want to say is, there's a feeling as you read this, and your brain is sort of primed to think about it, that you're like, why are we telling 7 stories about the exact same event in history? And it may be that there were 7 different versions of why David was the king, right? 7 different rationales. And the person who's putting it together is sort of taking all of the different strands and trying to weave them together in a way that makes sense, but ends up not making sense because there's redundancy, okay? So that's what we're going to see. So we're going to talk about these different stories, and we're going to walk through them very quickly. So again, to save time, we're not going to read everything. I'm just going to tell you what the story is. So the first story is that Saul is tormented by God. Right? And so this is a classic example. I'm just trying to put the verses down here. So this is 16, 14 through 23. So we can track along. So the first story is that Saul is tormented by God. That is that he is the tragic king. Right? So we know this from Shakespeare. I mean, this is, if you remember anything about from your Shakespeare, this is King Lear. This is the story of the king who used to be great, at the zenith of his power, something goes wrong, he kills all of his kids, and he falls from power, right? And this is a classic story. Every culture has these kinds of tragedies. It's one of the main sort of stories that we have about history. So one thing is that Saul is tormented, that he goes insane, and we have to pick a new king to replace him. So that's one rationale for why David comes to the throne. The second rationale is everybody's favorite Bible story in this, David and Goliath. And that's going to be, I think, all of chapter 17. Yes, that's just all of chapter 17. Okay. So we have David and Goliath, right? David, the little boy, 14 years old, takes 7 stones, his sling, cracks the big warrior. Now, I want you to notice that one of the interesting things about this is not only that it's a little boy defeating a giant, it's a little boy defeating a warrior. So the story is already coded in there as an allegory about the conflict between David and Saul, right? Saul is supposed to be the mighty king. He's supposed to go out in battle and defend Israel from their enemies, in this case, the Philistines. But he's too weak or scared or whatever to fight the giant himself. And no one else in Israel is strong enough or brave enough to do it, but it's the little boy from the middle of nowhere who's going to defeat him, right? It's the little boy from nowhere who's going to defeat the powerful warrior in the form of Goliath, and then is going to ultimately become the powerful king, replacing Saul. And so we already have some encoding in the story about the conflict between them, right? It's also the idea of, in that story, which is why we always love it in Sunday school, of that the power isn't from military might, it's from God's presence. Right, so we already have God's presence coming upon David at the anointing. We have God's presence leaving Saul, and we have God's presence giving him power. Right, so this is how whoever's bringing the story together. The technical term for that is called the redactor. Right, whoever the redactor is of these stories has already. This is the thread we're going to use. It's God's presence that gives Israel its power. That's the moral of the story. Is that it doesn't matter if you are nobody, if God's with you, then you'll defeat the armies. We saw that last time in the previous chapters when we talked about the downfall of Saul, that's what happened when Saul was rejected by God. Is he tried to move and act without God's presence or God's favor, and God said, you're not my king anymore. If you're not going to let me do the work, I'm just going to withdraw my favor from your nation, and I'm going to go find someone else, right? So that's already in there. Okay, so then in chapter 18, we have Jonathan, I'm going to use befriends David. Now, this is a very important story in the way of setting up some tension within the story. Got David up here since I've got him. All right. Which is that Jonathan is the rightful heir to Saul's kingdom, right? He's the son. If Saul, like in every other tragedy, when the king goes crazy and he has to gouge his eyes off and throw himself off the cliff or whatever the story tells him he has to do to atone for his sins, then the son is supposed to take the throne. But Jonathan gives up his right to the throne to David. Right? We have this idea in which Jonathan, and the symbol there is, I'm just going to jump to verse 4 of chapter 18 here. It says, Jonathan stripped himself of the robe that was on him and gave it to David and his armor and even his sword, his bow, and his belt. And David went out and was successful wherever Saul sent him, so that Saul set him over the men of war. Now, the issue here is that Jonathan is physically transferring all of the accoutrements of his right to the throne. Right? He's dressing David up in his clothes and making David the one who the people see as the rightful heir to Saul. He gives up his right to take the throne. You wouldn't do this, right? This is like, I don't know, Prince William saying, I don't want to be the prince anymore. I'm going to find some dude in London and I'm going to make him the future king. Right? That doesn't happen. It doesn't really work that way. Right? But this is the symbolism we're going to have. And again, this sort of brings to the end one sort of transitional point, one sort of arc. So we have the first arc, which is this arc of God's favor, right? So, let me put a dotted line in here, right? So we have God's favor is what really describes these sets of stories, right? God has moved his spirit off of Saul onto David, and that gives David power to win battles, and then the people respond to that in the form of Jonathan by transferring their allegiance to David. Okay, so then at the second part, we're going to have David being brought into the sort of fold of Saul. And so we're going to have David as new heir. Now, that's an S, right? Yeah. So, and we see that a little bit. So this Jonathan story forms the pivot in which we're pivoting between two principles of organizing the stories. Okay? And so, the fourth story is that David marries Michal. Now, Michal, not to be confused with Michael, which is a different Bible name. Michal is the daughter of Saul, and she's the prize to the person who, I'm getting my verses here, to the person who is victorious in battle. So Michal is the way you spell her name. Now, if you read that story, you're going to see that there's a redundancy in here. And that redundancy is that the point of the story is to win a battle. Right? So we had a battle scene here. Right? David goes out and Saul basically says, whoever's going to defeat this Philistine giant will basically win my favor and be one of my, great warriors. Right? And what's going to happen here is the same thing happens. Again, the issue here is a battle. Because Saul needs to defeat the Philistines again. And he says, here is my elder daughter, Merab. I will give him to you as a wife. Only be valiant and fight for me in your battles. And David has this beautiful little saying, which again is an issue of the way that we're supposed to write, which is like, who am I that someone who's not even a prince should earn the favor of, right? This is the, Sir Lancelot, marching in and, right, like this, we've all heard this story, right? Like the nobody guy is gonna, win the hand of Maid Marian and Robin Hood's gonna whatever, right? Okay. But what happens is that the story turns because we make it an impossible task. Right? So Saul is supposed to give Merab to David. He decides, no, I don't want to do that. Why? It's actually really smart. Because if he marries David to his daughter, then David becomes part of his family and now has a right to the throne. And Saul's not stupid. He knows that if he does this, David's winning all the battles. David has the favor of the people. David has the favor of his son. If I give him my daughter, then he becomes my heir. Jonathan's out of the picture, and David gets to be king. He's like, I'm not going to do it. So then he sets it up in an impossible task. Again, think Sir Lancelot, Robin Hood, whatever, right? He says, okay, I need you to go kill 100 Philistines, and to prove it, I need you to bring back the one distinction between an Israelite and a Philistine, which is their foreskin. Right, so Israelites are circumcised, Philistines are not. Right, so the only way you're going to prove to me that you killed a Philistine is you cut off parts they're not allowed for us to talk about in church at this time of the morning. Because that's the only way, I mean, that's what it is. The Bible is very real about it, but, I don't want to be, since I'm being recorded, I don't want to have to say some of these words here right now. This is getting posted on the internet, so there's that. That's how you're going to know you killed him, because, let's be frank, you're not going to be able to cut that off of some dude until he's dead. Okay, so that's how I know they're dead, because that's what you bring back to him. And so David does. He brings back 100 foreskins, and he gets the bride price. He does the task he has to do, right? And again, what's interesting here is the idea of that, we in our society don't really fully comprehend that we still have bride prices, but that's the way it worked in the ancient world, is that you did a task, or you paid a certain amount of money, and that's how you got married to someone, because you had to give them, a piece of jewelry worth a certain amount of money to prove that you were worthy of them, right? You with me? That's why we all wear these rings on our fingers. And we're not going to get into people who wear rings. They're not made of precious metals and are made of plastic and what that's worth to you, but whatever. Side note. Anyway, so that's the point, is that we have, again, a connection that's forming. This is part of that redundancy. Up to this point, we could have said, okay, there's different stories, they all sort of form a purpose of this larger arc of God's favor. Now we're going to do a different set of stories that'll bring it into focus, right? So we sort of repeat ourselves is what I'm saying. And noticing that repetition, you're like, didn't he already defeat the giant and win the hand of the maiden? Why are we doing it again? We're doing it again because we have two sets of stories probably that are being brought together. Okay, so then our fifth story is that Saul attempts to kill David. This is chapter 19, right? And here, we're going to fold back into what we had before. That is that Saul is crazed. So we have the image again of the king who has gone insane. The king who's no longer worthy to be king. Who's doing something that is beyond the pale, beyond what we can accept as a society, and proving that they need to be removed in someone else. Because again, the idea is this is not democracy in the ancient world. You don't get elected to be king. And so you can't be impeached or removed from office. You don't have an end of the term. The way we get rid of you is we either kill you with another king or we remove you as king. And so we're setting up the stage that he needs to be removed as king because he's taking his most powerful warrior and trying to kill him. That's stupid. You shouldn't do that, right? And so there's this whole story in which Saul tries to kill David. He tries to put David into the worst ways. Part of the story, Saul takes his spear and tries to hit David, throws it, tries to kill David in front of everybody at a party. That's probably not really great. And then Michal, who loves David this time, hides him. So it's this beautiful. I love it. It's just her dad just threw the spear at her husband, and she's like, okay, you got to go. This is not good. You got to get going. Daddy is going to get the shotgun. He's going to kill you. We're not going to do this. So she lets him down out of the window. He climbs down on the outside of the wall, and she puts a statue in the bed and covers it and makes it look like David's asleep so that they will stab him, as in the wooden statue instead of David. It's really funny. So this is part of I wish we would make a little cartoon of this because it would be really funny to watch how it is. All right, anyway, so Saul is trying to kill David, and that's going to be a theme that's going to continue for a couple of chapters. We're basically going to have this cycle of Saul tries to kill David, David escapes and sometimes has the opportunity to turn the tables on Saul and kill him back, but doesn't take it. And then Saul repents, and they're back in favor with each other, right? And again, the cycle of stories there, the redundancy is supposed to make you think, why are we hearing the same story over and over again, right? I got it. He's stupid. He's crazy. Why is David giving him 17 chances to almost kill him? And then David's like, well, I'm not going to kill you back. And oh, well, I guess we're friends again. Why do we have redundancy? Because we have various versions of this story, right? So we're going to get, let's see, how many is this? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. About 5 versions of the story over the next few chapters. And we're going to get into some of them. You'll see some of them in the next section, but I probably won't cover them. So there's 5 times when the story goes like this. Saul gets mad at David. Saul goes out to go find David, tries to kill David. David escapes. David can turn the tables on him, and now he has the upper hand, and he can kill Saul whenever he wants to. Chooses not to kill Saul. Is the better man. And then Saul's like, oh, you are supposed to be the king, right? This revelatory stage, again, in the technical literary term is anagoresis. That's a fun word for Scrabble. Anagoresis is the awakening or the recalling of the truth within the story. And it's a classic trope of how stories work. Every story that we can remember has that, right? The Beauty and the Beast is the best example, right? The beast is ugly because he's an ugly person on the inside, and then his one true love finds who his real character is before the last moment, and his ugliness is shed, and his beauty is revealed as who he's supposed to be, right? Because all heroes in stories have to be handsome or beautiful, and all villains have to be ugly. That's the way stories work. Anyway, so sorry if you're an ugly person. You're a villain in the ancient world. Anyway, but there's 5 versions of the story. Which means that probably there's 5 different instances that people are like, oh yeah, I remember when Saul was going to kill David. Oh, here's how it went. It was at Gath. It was at Endor. It was at blah, blah, blah. It doesn't really matter, right? The point is that the cycle is setting up and proving by almost beating it into our head that David is the rightful righteous king who rules with justice, and Saul is insane and doesn't deserve our support, right? It's political. It's a political messaging. This guy can do no wrong. This guy does only wrong, right? And continues from there. And then the last part of the story that I want to hear in chapter 20 is this sort of friendship with David and Jonathan again. And, we'll call this Jonathan saves David. Right. And so again, we have this trope of friendship. Now, friendship in the ancient world is not trading, matching bracelets and being BFFs forever. Friendship in the ancient world, particularly when we talk about powerful people like kings and princes and warriors, is really alliance and support. Right? So if we moved into our modern sort of political ramifications, this is when 2 different powerful people decide to form an agreement so that they can both have an advantage. Right? This is the governor of one state supporting the other governor of another state in his presidential run for the office. Right? They both could have done it, but one knows that the other one has a better chance, and so I'm going to throw in my hat with you, and I'm going to support you and endorse you and give you money and talk you up, and then you're going to scratch my back and make me, ambassador to China next year. Right? Or you're going to make me Secretary of State, or you're going to make me your vice president, or whatever it is, right? It's not friendship in the we love each other and hold hands way. It's friendship in the way that we are making a trade and consolidating our power for some good purpose. Same thing is happening here. So Jonathan, this is within the story of Saul killing David. Jonathan goes to save David, and he makes David promise him something, which is going to be important when we get to later on in 2 Samuel, when you talk about sort of the what I'm going to call the turn of David's career. So David has this beautiful ascendancy here in 1 Samuel, and he has a couple of good golden years where everything goes right, and then he has the same problem as Saul. He gets too old, he gets to be a bad king, and it's time for his kingdom to be transferred as well. We're going to see it happen again. So we set up the beginning of the story here. Jonathan makes David promise. And so he says to him, let me find it. Jonathan says, far be it from me, if I knew that it was determined by my father that harm would come to you, would I not tell you? And he said, who would tell me if your father answers me roughly? He says, I will. And so he goes back and says, if my father will dispose of you, then I will send for you. Right? I'm going to go ask my dad what's happening. If he says that he's going to kill you, then I'm going to tell you. You just go hide here so that you don't get killed. I think that he's fine. I think he's fine. He's just bluffing or whatever it is. He's just talking out of the side of his head. He says, so if he comes back, it's a good answer. I'll tell you. If it's not a good answer, then I won't tell you. Right? And so then he sets up that what happens is he hears that Saul is not happy with him, and now Saul is going to throw the spear at his own son, right? We have the same setup, right? Before Saul tried to kill with David with the spear, and now he's going to try to kill his own son Jonathan. Completely crazy. That's the point. And so Jonathan knew that his father was determined to put David to death. And Jonathan rose, and he had no time, and he left. And he said, let's skip it down. And so then, verse 42, then Jonathan said to David, go in peace, for we have sworn both of us in the name of the Lord, saying, the Lord shall be between me and you, and between my offspring and your offspring forever. Now this is setting up a point. It's like, this is the alliance. We are together. We are joined in a pact, a political alliance that lasts not only between us, it aligns between our children. Right? And we're going to see later on when Jonathan is well in the grave and David has the opportunity to eliminate his lineage by killing all of his children, he doesn't take it. Why? Because he's made a pact with Jonathan now, before he's even king. Right? And so we have this repetition here. It's a little bit of change in the order. We have the same three elements of the story that occur. And of course, the idea here is that David is successful in battle, right? And so he's accepted in all the story. We didn't get into that because of time. But like the people look at David and they go, he's the great warrior. In fact, this is the thing that actually sets it off in my mind in Saul's. If I had to pick a point in this story which Saul gets really mad, here's what it is. In the middle of chapter 18, they come back from the battle of destroying the Philistines. And the women came out of all the cities of Israel singing and dancing to meet King Saul with their tambourines and their songs of joy and their musical instruments. Okay? Right? So he's parading in military victory. And this is the song they're singing. Saul has killed a couple of thousand, but David has killed 10,000. Right? You're an okay king, but that other guy, he's better than you are. Right? And Saul was very angry, and this saying displeased him. Really? Surprising, right? Anyway, so the elements we saw last time in chapters 13 through 15, 12 through 15, I think it was last time, those three elements are reversed with David. Saul was rejected, David is successful and supported by the people. Saul is rejected by God, David is accepted by God. Saul is rejected by his own heir, Jonathan, and accepted and loved, but Jonathan loves David, right? So this transference between the two nations is encapsulated in these two people. And then even the way we tell those stories is encapsulated, right? The David and Goliath thing, which I think is very interesting. It's an allegory of what's actually happening between David and Saul, right? And what the tension there is. And so as we look at these stories, we need to look at them with like a fresh set of eyes sometimes and really see what's happening behind the scenes, which explains a lot of what's going on and why there's redundancy in the text. All right?